A Blackburnian Warbler is the subject of this 9 by 12 inch transparent watercolor. Over the years I've had the opportunity to render these birds a few times, but they're so pretty I couldn't resist doing another. I did this painting on a block of Kilimanjaro 140-pound cold-pressed paper. After frisketing off my foreground with masking fluid, I mixed all of my background colors. I had 2 blues and 3 greens ready to go. My lighter blue was cerulean blue and French ultramarine, and my darker blue was French ultramarine and dioxazine purple. The 2 lighter greens were mixes of sap green and lemon yellow in varying amounts. My darkest green was sap green and cadmium red. I pre-wet my paper in preparation for a wet-on-wet wash. When doing a wash, it's generally a good idea to tilt your page so gravity helps pull the paint down the page. If your wash has a gradient, it's best to put the darkest colors on the bottom where they naturally want to collect. If you work in the other direction, well, you're kind of fighting physics of the operation and the gradients may be more subtle than you'd like. I slipped an eraser under the top edge to tilt the page. Although this gradient won't be very dramatic, I wanted my darkest colors towards the top, so I flipped the page to do the wash. Using a 1-inch flat brush, I began at the top and worked my way down the page, changing up my mixes gradually as I progressed to the bottom. I sucked off any extra pigment that was puddling with a dry paintbrush and tissue paper, so the paper was evenly wet. This prevents backruns. While the page was still wet, I used a number 6 round brush to put in some blurry leaves. These will have nice soft edges since they went in on the wet surface. Once I was happy with the basic background, I hit it with the hairdryer to settle it on the page. To get a bit of the transition from my hard-edged foreground that's been frisketed off, I started glazing in some leafy areas on the dry page. I don't need a ton of information on these, I just did some basic shapes and a tiny bit of shading. I'll adjust these areas more once the foreground has more painting done. It's always a good idea to hit the paper with a hairdryer before removing the frisket. If there was any wet pigment, you might smear it around during removal otherwise. With the frisket off, I transferred my foreground sketch using a tracing paper transfer. For the rest of the painting, I'll be working light to dark, adding many layers of glazed paint. I start by putting in all the lightest colors on the foreground. For the branches, I did a light base coat of Indian red, phthalo blue, and dioxazine purple. The leaves started with a layer of lemon yellow with a little sap green. I used slightly greener mix for the shadows and spared the highlights. For the warbler's throat and face, I used a base of chrome orange moving to lemon yellow. Everything from here out was glazing in dozens and dozens of light layers of transparent color. As is often the case with my paintings, the branches and the leaves represented the majority of the detail. Most of my work was done with a number 2 round synthetic brush. I'll wear one of these out about every 5 or 6 paintings. You may notice that I have a small spring on the back of the brush's handle. Because I wear these out all the time, I'll have old dull brushes hanging around that I use for mixing paint. In order to quickly tell these apart, I have a small spring stuck on the end of the good sharp brush so I can find it quickly. Blackburnian Warblers sure are gorgeous, but they're kind of frustrating to photograph. These guys like treetops, and despite their bold black, white, and orange colors, they hide in the foliage really well, especially the less colorful female birds. I'm usually best able to find them when I hear their high-pitched calls and I know to look more carefully for them. What's interesting to me is how a brilliantly colored bird with high contrast can hide so well. As I was painting this guy, I thought about it more. Those yellows aren't all that far in color from the backlit greens, and the stripy black patterns break up the outline of the bird's body almost like a zebra. That bright orange is almost the same value as the green leaves. All that added up makes for a pretty cryptic bird in its native habitat. When you get one of these spectacular birds framed up against a perfect blue sky like this, well, that's a magical moment. Most often I come away with a sore neck from looking straight up and some backlit photos of tiny birds half obscured by the foliage that's in between us. I got the photos that I used for reference from our yearly spring pilgrimage to Northwest Ohio for migration. Despite the strong backlighting in the shots, I was able to get some good exposures between spot metering and exposure compensation in camera. Most of the shots weren't great, but I did have a shot with a good pose to work from. Unfortunately, the photo was a tiny bit blurry. In addition to the bird's pose, what worked in the photo was the lighting with some glowing backlit walnut leaves. I most often like working from photos like this where the shot wasn't perfect but had some neat things to work with and reinvent. To my eye, what made the photos interesting was the fairly high contrast and great color saturation, looking almost like stained glass. The overlapping shadows on the bright green-yellow leaves added to the interest and promised to make for a super lively pattern. As I glazed in many layers, I try not to overwork this painting and leave some of the brushwork more visible. With the backlighting, there was much less information to work with, which actually was kind of fun for a change. In general, the midrib on the leaves and the major veins were visible, and not much else other than the dappled shadows of the other leaves. The thicker stems, those were darker and more opaque. You can see that I kept my initial background colors in the well plate handy to pull from, supplementing those with colors from the butcher's tray. Each pass of color was quite transparent. I was sort of sneaking up on the darker colors with many glazes. When doing the videos, I try not to rotate the page so it's easier to watch. Normally, I like to rotate the page to match the natural direction of the rotation of my hand. Long, straight, and gentle curved lines definitely are easier in some orientations. I never like painting from the outside of a curve. Some things just feel more natural, and you want to rotate your canvas to match that if you want nice, smooth lines. When doing the detailed painting, I usually wear a thin cotton glove with the fingertips cut off the thumb, index, and middle fingers. This helps keep the paints from smudging while still giving me a good feel and grip on the brush. If you're doing a lot of detailed work, it can really help keep things clean, especially late in a painting as things get more opaque. I worked for a long time on the leaves since my palette already had the greens mixed. Once those were in, I started working more on darkening up my backlit branches. I painted these with mixes of Indian red, dioxazine purple, and phthalo blue. I glazed in many scribbly layers to build up depth. As those overlap, it starts to look more textural and bumpy. Partway through, I started adding in some cadmium red to render those branches a little more pinkish. I like working around a painting so nothing gets neglected for too long. With so much attention given to the background, I started to paint in some detail to the star of the show, our Blackburnian Warbler. I glazed in many layers of color from lemon yellow in the lighter parts to chrome orange on the throat. The bird's blackish colors were darkened using my branched dark colors of Indian red, phthalo blue, and dioxazine purple, and for the absolute darkest areas, phthalo green and permanent alizarin crimson. Shading on the belly went in with some of my background sky colors with a touch of my leaf green as a reflected light. For the tiny details of the feet, beak, and eyes, and some tail details, I did switch to a 10-aught brush. There's always a lot of fussy brush work on the birds, but they do tend to go in relatively quickly. The most intense throat areas had additional darkening and added saturation with cadmium red, and in the very darkest areas some permanent alizarin crimson. With the warbler mostly finished, I got back to work on the branch and the 8 billion leaves. I need to push the branches a bit darker, especially around the bird. I added some chrome orange in a light glaze to a few areas of the leaves to pull those areas a little closer in color to the bird's throat. I also added a little orange here and there to the branches. Late in the game, I decided my leaves needed some sharpening up in places, and the contrast beefed up a little. I switched to a 10-aught brush for this and added more dark details. It's amazing how many little things you can find to pick away at toward the end of a painting like this. Often it's just correcting some little marks where the frisket wasn't perfectly placed, or a small twig that needs a sharper shadow. After tons of tiny corrections, I ran out of things that needed revisions, I signed it, and I called it quits. On this one, I was trying not to overpaint those backlit leaves and to use a little less glazing. Well, there you have it, a 9 by 12 inch transparent watercolor of a male Blackburnian Warbler. I hope you enjoyed seeing it take shape. The original is currently available. I'll put a link in the video description to my Etsy shop if you're interested. I'll also put a link in below to sign up for a newsletter with some watercolor tips and other information. If you enjoy the video, please subscribe to the channel and give it a like. I hope you get a chance to get out the watercolors soon.